Welcome, everybody. My name is Amanda Brock. I'm CEO at OpenUK, and it's a real honour to be invited to join you at Open Lisbon. I was privileged to be asked to keynote this morning, and am now able to join you to talk to you about open source and a cloud environment. It's open under the cloud, you know. If you saw me speak this morning, you would have heard me introduce myself. In case not, I'm very briefly going to introduce the organisation to you. OpenUK is the industry advocacy body and representation for the three opens: open source software, open hardware, and open data, which form open technology. Our amazing board of 12 who came on board in January, we're only really a year old as an organisation. They created a vision, mission, and purpose for us, with a vision of developing and sustaining UK leadership in open technology. Not an inward-looking activity, but one where we collaborate globally and hope to work more with all of you here as time goes by. We have three pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning, under which all of our activities sit. In the case of community, we're building a loud and visible voice to help influence the UK with respect to open and to bring together our communities. In terms of legal and policy, we want to make the UK a great place for us and others to do open business. We were very honoured to be included by the Commission recently in their OSR briefing as the UK's actor for open technology and open source. And finally, we are building learning and education, building the workforce of the future through activities like our kids competition and camp this year. You can find them at openuk.uk/openkidscamp, where you will see a 10-episode animated course and 10 e-zines. We will rerun the camp next April and have a further course and camp next summer. I very much hope that we will also succeed in having those translated into Portuguese, French, Spanish, and German. So they will be available to you not only in Creative Commons, but in your local languages next year. Fingers crossed. As well as working with OpenUK, I have a number of other roles, including at OIN. I chair an advisory for the UN's Technology Innovation Labs and sit on both the KDE and OASIS Open Projects advisory boards. I'm the editor of a book to come out next spring, Free and Open Source Software Law, Policy and Practice, which will be, I hope, a fairly seminal text on open source. A lot of work gone into it from over 20 authors who form the great and the good of legal and policy around open source. And I'm really proud to tell you that not only will it be published by Oxford University Press, but it will be available as an open access book in e-reader and PDF format, thanks to the very generous sponsorship of the Veitch Foundation. Also, my job is to do things like this, and I would normally say I travel the world. At the moment, I travel my kitchen, sometimes even make it further afield in my home to talk with people at open source and other conferences as part of my role as an open source advocate. And how did I get into all of this? Well, at the beginning of 2008, I joined what was then, and I think often since still has been, open source's biggest organisation in Europe, Canonical, where I worked with Mark Shuttleworth, the founder. And Mark is somebody that I don't think you could argue, anybody could argue, is not a visionary. He is absolutely a visionary when it comes to technology and open. And the 5 years I was at Canonical was a truly interesting and inspirational experience, because what was going on there was the development of a business that sold services on a support model around open source, but which also was maturing around the time of the cloud computing takeoff, the boom. I was there from the beginning of 2008 till the end of 2012, so you can probably put that in place in timing. And working closely with Mark, one of the things that I know he talks about is the lens of the past and the lens of the future when it comes to technology. And what he'll say is that you can't look at technology of tomorrow through the lens of the past, because in the past, software sat in the hands of the few. And now and in the future, We see a democratization of software. We see a change, we see a shift, and software today lies in the hands of the many. So where we've been and where we're going are very different places. He also talks in his Open Source Underdogs podcast, and I'll give you more information about those podcasts, which, if you're interested in commercial models and business and open source, are absolutely critical. Mark talks in his podcast about the nature of a business in open source being that you, in fact, you enable your competitors with your innovation. And that's a big statement, to enable one's competitors with one's own innovation. And he also goes on to be very vulnerable and very honest in that talk. And he talks about how that can be both financially and emotionally draining. And that's something, as I go through this talk, that I'll come back to. Now, one of the beauties of open source is collaboration, and another is competition. Whether you know Canonical or not, you will definitely know Red Hat. And Red Hat was sold last year to IBM for $34 billion, making it the biggest tech transaction in history. And Red Hat was the dominant player in the cloud marketplace when I was in Canonical. I worked with our then cloud director, Simon Wardley, who, if you haven't heard speak, you really ought to. He's the most amazing open source speaker and one of the best in the world. And Simon will tell you that we took our cloud market share to something like 73 or 76% of the marketplace almost overnight. And because Red Hat had been the dominant player in that marketplace, that market share obviously moved from Red Hat to Canonical. Despite that, we were able to collaborate, and we worked together on the founding of Openstack. I have this tombstone or trophy still all these years later from being on the drafting committee. I think I was the only European involved in it, on the legal and drafting side at least. And it was quite amazing to me to see an organization of that scale, where not just Canonical and Red Hat, but companies like ARM and Intel, Dell and HP were able to compete tooth and nail with each other in their day-to-day businesses, yet engage in collaboration on open source. And that collaboration is absolutely fundamental. It's where you have many eyes making better software, scratching the itch communally rather than each of us scratching the same itch to produce different outputs, creating standards and allowing huge cost savings and an increased pace of development around innovation. And I mentioned also in my keynote, this version of the card is the same actually. It demonstrates just the value of that cloud space with over 1,500 packages involved, 1,500 cards for different organizations and packages in open source, the investment in the billions and the market capitalization in the trillions. That cloud market space has been absolutely fundamental, and it's made this shift in business and a shift in our personal lives. If we just pause for a moment to think about it, everything these days is on a cloud-based infrastructure. Everything has moved away from, not everything, but almost everything has moved away into the cloud from our own server management. We work in different business and commercial models today. That's true of our personal interactions through our smartphones, through our devices, through our apps, as well as our business interactions. Now, I thought I would also just flag a few of the packages. If you look at the bottom right, I haven't even put the name against this one because we all know it's Kubernetes, released into the open source community by Google, but something that is fundamental to the development and the success of cloud, and many other packages revolve around the management of that. Now, if we think about it, there is no way we would have the cloud infrastructure or scale that we have without open source. And this is absolutely fundamental, the infrastructure that is open under the cloud. But of course, what we have with open source is the ability to use software without a license fee. And many of the licenses designed for distribution, with distribution as a trigger. There are some which are designed to work server-side also. But we saw a number of businesses follow the path that Canonical went down and create support models. I mentioned before Red Hat. Red Hat is in a very particular position. I sometimes describe it as a double unicorn. It was the biggest tech transaction in history with its sale of 34 billion. Clearly, valuation wise, it is a unicorn. But its subscription model is slightly different. It bundles into that a number of things. And it's almost a guaranteed sale, unlike the support model where you sell straight support services, implementation, add-on services. And that gives an advantage to Red Hat, where that model has allowed it to be the double unicorn. It sits so close to the kernel. It was developed as a model 20 years ago. People are used to it. They accept that that's how they work with Red Hat. That's something that I don't think is really translated. And what we see is other open source businesses trying to build themselves, as Canonical did, on a more support-like model where they may sell consultancy services or find additional and add-on services to sell. And we've seen a transition happen between sort of 2017, 18 and 2020, where a number of other companies using models similar to Canonical's, where they distributed free and open source software, and were able to gain traction, massive traction by doing so. Then found that they were not making the kind of money that they wanted to make. Now, when I left Canonical, I joined a law firm, and in the law firm, as the former GC of Europe's biggest open source company, I was regularly, if not constantly, approached by young entrepreneurs who wanted to open source their software offerings and their business plan. They wanted to create what they would call an open source company. And I came up with 3 quick questions in my what if theory. And it was pretty much, what if you build this and somebody else takes it and uses it? They would react in a variable way. What if somebody else takes and uses it and makes money out of it? And you could see maybe not quite so happy. What if you build this, somebody else takes it, uses it, makes money out of it, and you make nothing, or you make some, but they make an awful lot more? And a lot of those people never came back and spoke to me again. I quite simply put them off, because when they sat down and they tried to work out how their financial model would work, they couldn't. And what we saw between 2017, 18 and 2020 is a number of fairly high profile, largely US companies come a cropper. Maybe a lawyer didn't talk to them about the what if theory up front. Maybe they didn't have the experience or opportunity to consider those things. But what happened to them is something that's perfectly acceptable within the world of open source, in that they released software as open source and someone else took it, used it, and made money out of it. Open source is non-discriminatory, and that's what happens. And that led to a number of different reactions from a number of those companies. One that I've got on the screen here, Redis Labs, led to the drafting of the Commons Clause, which is particularly problematic. The Commons Clause is an add-on clause that in theory you would add to an open source license. It does say on their website, is this open source? No. And it goes on to say that, I think it says you may not, it is best not to call Commons Clause software open source. Well, that frankly is totally incorrect. It is wrong to call Commons Clause software open source. It just isn't. It's closed source. By adding this clause to an open source license, you make it proprietary. It's very simple. And we saw a bunch of different organizations. I don't want to pick on Redis. It's just this is a very easy and clear example to give. We saw a bunch of different organizations go through, over a period of a couple of years, similar pains. And they were pains around their business model development, which got attributed to open source because they came from a belief in open source and having given away a lot of their software open source. That sort of came to a head with Elastic, where there's apparently a falling out, and Elastic software was used by Amazon. Being on an open source license, that was something that was absolutely legitimate for Amazon to do, as Amazon was quick to point out. But there is an ongoing trademark dispute, which we are still waiting for the outcome of, delayed by the pandemic. Now, because of those different companies' reactions, what we saw was the cloud companies using open source in a very profitable way start to look to themselves and wonder how they could deal with these issues. And I think it would have been April 2018 with the pandemic this year. Sometimes everything gets a bit confused date-wise, but I think April 2018 We saw Google bring some of those companies in and do a revenue sharing deal, allowing the companies that were in the service layer and whose services were being, or whose software was being used by Google to generate revenue, to share some of that revenue. And I think Google's to be commended for that. It's probably the right approach, but difficult to imagine how one could really scale that. And also something that's arbitrary, leaving the control or the power in the hands of the company who is the cloud provider, utilizing those services that sit under the cloud. We also saw this hit the mainstream press in December 2019. And that's something in some ways I was surprised to see, but the New York Times reported, not specific to open source, but in a more general way, and fitting into that big picture that we're seeing of people looking more carefully at the activities of big tech. And what we see is with Amazon, their use of smaller companies' tools being described as strip mining, where they have legitimately taken those tools under an open source license, used them on my what if theory to make a lot of money, and haven't necessarily been perceived by the companies from whose software they've used to be giving enough back. Amazon, of course, responded, setting the record straight, and claiming that many companies were very happy with the relationship with them. They had Andy Gutmans, who is a very respected figure in open source, write the blog responding and put his name to the blog responding to that. And I believe, from what I'm aware anyway, that what Amazon did in technical terms and in terms of licensing wasn't in any way wrong. The question is whether or not it sits within the ethos of open source and whether or not it in itself will destroy smaller companies in open source. And in some ways, that's a question for the competition authorities, who I know we've seen various reports, both in the US and Europe, have been looking into the big cloud providers and how this happens. But also it goes to this very question of how open source is able to develop business models that work in a cloud environment. And I mentioned previously the Open Source Underdogs podcast. This is some information on it. You'll see Melissa Donata from SUSE is one of the people featured there. And interestingly, SUSE has recently bought Rancher Labs. And I wanted to show you this screenshot from Rancher and Pivotal, because two companies, both who've been acquired since these podcasts were done, Pivotal, of course, by VMware, where both of the interviewees were very clear that in their view, despite the giving away of the software, that the infrastructure of open source left good opportunity to make money. And listening to Shannon Williams in particular, you hear a very strong case for using open source when you develop a business, because you have that opportunity to scale dramatically and quickly. What Mark Shuttleworth would have described as ubiquity, the thing that you were seeking. It's not the revenue, it's the ubiquity. It's the sitting under everybody else's services where you become essential and that you create value. I think data stacks refer to the same thing now as abundance. And that's very much part of the model that companies working in open source tend to use. Andy Oram, who was at O'Reilly for many years and an open source pundit, talks about the opposite. He talks about, rather than looking at open core, which these companies were developing into, where they would take the open source piece and somehow carve out a proprietary or commercial model that would be viewed as proprietary around it, maybe doing a freemium to premium type model. Andy talks about closed core, the kind of model a company like Google used when it developed Kubernetes, where it will throw something over the fence once developed. And in Kubernetes' case, obviously, goes on to have a major impact, not just on open source, but on the world. So why does this matter? Well, he and I obviously think it matters, job, but don't rely on open source pundits like us. Let's look at Microsoft briefly. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer 10, 12 years ago notoriously called open source a cancer, and people who used it parasites. Satya Nadella is on this screen in 2018, and the screen is from Steve Wally, my mate Steve Wally, who you can see in the foreground, from his keynote at the Linux Foundation event in Edinburgh. And Satya is instead saying, judge us by the actions we have taken in the recent past, our actions today and in the future. And he's saying this because he wants to dissociate from the past and the open source as a cancer type thought process. Now, how did Microsoft go from open source being a cancer to making available the relevant patents in its 60,000 patent portfolio to the open source community through OIN? And Steve explains that journey beautifully, and he explains it on the basis of three things. 10 years ago, customers didn't ask Microsoft for open source. Today they do. In the last couple of decades, developers have learned to code and learned to develop using open methodologies and open practices. The Linux kernel was developed and released in 1989. Since then, people who have developed have all been exposed to open, and the best developers have learned to work in that way and want to work in that way. So if Microsoft wanted to hire the best developers, they had to go down that road of openness. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, Steve would joke about this product they have called Azure. You might have heard of it. Well, of course we've heard of it. One of the biggest cloud providers in the world. And cloud, of course, sits under all of our business today. And what Steve says about it is that Azure, like all public cloud, is built on open source. And to be able to run a public cloud business, Microsoft had to go through that transition and that ability to both use the software and give back. So moving from initially just being a user to being a contributor and going through a journey on the open source process because of that. Now, what we see today is that with digital transformation, which has only escalated through the pandemic, all companies are becoming tech companies. All companies are getting to that point where they need to hire developers and where they're in the position that Microsoft might have been in the past. But all companies today are actually using open source in their cloud environments. They're using open source in the internet infrastructure and environments that they're working in. What they may not yet realize is that they're all open source users. And we're rapidly seeing the adoption of open source and that change primarily because of cloud. So I would leave you with a couple of thoughts. We've seen the difficulties faced by some companies where the big cloud providers put them in a position that they don't feel they're generating enough revenue for them to survive. And if we want to have those wonderful open source products continue to be developed by small, young, upstart, innovative companies, then we need to make sure that their code is protected, and we need to make sure that we do that by collaboration and giving back, and that we find routes to support the business models for those companies. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have no doubt that it's open under the cloud, and that we want to keep that cloud safe for the future. So if you have questions, I'm going to stay around for a little while and I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.